Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode. And today, I'm joined by Jim Delaney. Jim is a Naval Academy graduate. He's a former naval aviator. He's a serial C-suite executive. He's currently the founder of Traction AI. He's also a friend, a mentor. He's a great American. He's been helping us at TMV with our sales process, which we're very grateful for, Jim. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite you to subscribe, share the podcast with a friend. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Appreciate being on your show.
Sir, I have given a 30,000-foot overview of your background, but it's always really helpful to hear it in the first person. So can you take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Sure, Brendan. I'll try and keep it short and hopefully as interesting as I can make it. As you mentioned, I had gone to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1990. And for my service and commissioning, I went down to Pensacola, Florida to begin my life as what was going to be my Top Gun career. Fortunately, these big Irish ears of mine had something different in mind. And about a year and a half into the program, I ended up getting NPQ'd for what they call a eustachian tube dysfunction. And while I was terribly disappointed at the time, the career transition for me launched me out of naval aviation and into Navy cryptology. And I offer that because that was my first foray into big data before it became a buzzword, large comms networks that were designed that leveraged AI. Back then was just called advanced math, that was largely around probability-based decision-making as it related to protecting national interest. I think that was the good backdrop because after my service academy commitment and transitioning from the military into the civilian sector, ultimately a career in data analytics, a career in big data AI, a lot of that was built on the foundational elements that were learned during my time in the military. So that was really the foundational elements. In terms of career jobs, like so many perhaps of your audience, when I was leaving the military, one, it was a very difficult decision for me because it almost felt as though there was a stigma, a negative stigma associated with betraying my fellow great Americans serving in the military because I wanted to leave after my initial commitment. And so I felt emotional about that, but then also a bit traumatized, to be honest, because I didn't know how my military background and experience could actually be parlayed and explained, especially given the National Security Agency background that I had, how it could be explained and how I could be a really useful engine, so to speak, in the civilian world. So it was with great fear and trepidation that I took the easy way out. I worked as a network engineer for Verizon Communications from Fort Meade, Maryland to Baltimore, Maryland, my first job. And I realized I absolutely hated it. And like so many of my Naval Academy classmates getting out of the military, they all went right back to business school. And so like you, I went back to business school in an effort to reinvent myself, to actually learn how to spell like statement of cash flows and balance sheet and basic business jargon. And I think business school actually gave me the confidence and the time to begin to think through exactly what I wanted to do. And my initial job was working at JP Morgan Chase. I worked there for about 6 years before then launching into this career in data analytics. I was part of the executive team at Dun & Bradstreet for about 5-6 years. And it was really through a chance interaction with Mark Benioff over at Salesforce, where he and I together jointly worked on an offering that's become data.com. But it was really there that he opened my eyes about the world of venture capital, private equity. And I started to realize that a lot of my natural proclivities were much more entrepreneurial. And so I left Dun & Bradstreet to work for Omer's Private Equity, running one of their portfolio companies called MarketWired, which ultimately we sold to NASDAQ. And then since then, I've been sort of a serial entrepreneur, serial CEO, working for a number of startups to become grow-ups, and did that, had an exit with a company called Sysomos that we sold to Meltwater, and have been an investor in AI and data analytics companies over the past few years. Probably more of an answer than you wanted, but that chronological background is my career in a nutshell.
Jim, I always say it's the more you talk, about less I talk. It's better for everybody. It's better for you, it's me, it's audience for sure. I want to double click a little bit. You transitioned directly out of the military into a network engineering job. I feel like sometimes the advice I give to transitioning vets is you're probably going to have to try a few different things before you figure out what it is that you want to do. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like in terms of going into your first job and then recognizing, hey, this is probably not for me in the long term, and then how you figured out what it is that you wanted to do in the long term?
It's an interesting question because it's a personal one. And for your listening audience, what it really requires is that each of us in those first few jobs try to find the right fit or the right match in terms of our interest, in terms of our passion, et cetera. In my particular case, working as a network engineer for Verizon was one where I felt clipped in terms of a lot of my natural skill set. It was very limited to putting together custom design proposals. Back at the time, it was around ATM architectures and sonnet ring architectures, largely for municipalities and colleges and universities, et cetera. This is in the late 1990s, and it's in the early days of the internet explosion. And it was really around creating the bandwidth, the digital bandwidth to be able to support a lot of those technologies. But what I found is that as I thought about my career progression, I looked at my boss, who was an amazing man, an amazing leader, but I thought, did I really just want to grow up and become a leader of an engineering team? Because that was my destiny at that point. And I just had so many other interests and so much curiosity around growing a business, thinking about scaling a business, and not limiting it to just, in this particular case, telecommunications. And so that really is what thrust me to want more and be more. And then I think that the nudge, as I mentioned, was a lot of my very good friends who were getting out of the Navy and going back to business school. And I thought, why not use business school as an opportunity to interact with literally dozens of other students, find out what types of careers they had, whether they were enjoying them, and then see where I could find more of a personal fit between my goals, my passion, my interest, and the different various jobs that might be out there in the market space.
Yeah, it really is good for career exploration because you're interacting, to your point, like with so many people from so many different backgrounds who've pursued different things that you get a little bit of a flavor of it from your classmates, which I definitely found helpful. Even in just deconstructing, the civilian business world has its own jargon for sure.
Right on.
You know, it's like if you joined the Navy as like an 04 or something like that, and you had no background in all of the acronyms, you'd be lost as hell. And I feel like business is like much the same way. And when you're coming out of the military, you're hoping to transition into one of those mid-level roles. I think it's just really challenging if you're just fighting out of a hole to figure out what do these titles even mean? What do these career paths look like? What do I have to be good at for my job? There are just so many different intangibles that I found business school to be pretty helpful during the transition.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I really think that for so many of us who are in the military, we're obviously there with a common set of values. I think of us as being a privileged class. I often talk about the top 6.5% of Americans who are veterans because we were all united around a cause at a young age for something bigger than ourselves. Upon leaving, this is where the diversification in terms of what's next is available to us. And what I didn't want to do is to do the defense contractor path in the Beltway bubble. I actually knew that I wanted to do something different with the next chapter of my life.
Yeah, for sure. I feel a lot of us feel that way, I think. I want to ask you a question. It's funny to hear you describe your career primarily through the lens of like data analytics, because when I think about you, I always think about sales. Can you tell me a little bit about how those two fields are related and how sales has impacted your career and how you've built that skill set over time?
It's interesting, Brendan. I think that once again, you and I were forced to become students of business. In my case, I was 29, 30, just getting out of the military. And I remember just being maniacally focused, thinking about the disciplines, the pillars of business, right? So operations. I thought about finance. I thought about sales and marketing. And it was really, in my opinion, a race to playing catch up. I felt way behind my peer group who perhaps upon graduating at age 20, they had years to dig in and learn some of the fundamentals in a number of these areas. And so I was really just trying to become baseline proficient in finance, in operations, in sales and marketing. And one of the things that you realize very quickly, one, where you have a natural proclivity or skill set, but two, there has to be an area amongst those pillars where there's a degree of specialization, where you can make your name, make your mark. And one of my early mentors and bosses talked about businesses scaling and growing. And effectively, if you cannot commercialize your product, the business stops. And so right out the gate, I started to study and do my best to develop myself in the context of best sales techniques, best sales strategies, best sales processes. And then ultimately, in the various roles I've served in as a CEO, the go-to market element, meaning the sales, the marketing, the customer success around the renewal management, that's really where I've been able to be successful growing and scaling companies and to be able to do that well. So it's really because of that. Without sales, without your revenue operations, businesses simply don't survive. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you can't take it to market, if you can't grow it and scale it and market, the business, of course, stops.
I feel like it's like kind of one of the most obvious points in the world that was in no way obvious to me. And maybe it's because I was a Marine infantry guy and just took too many blows to the head. But yeah, sales is the absolute backbone of business. And I felt like when I was at Wharton, I don't think there was even a single sales class in the curriculum. Not how to sell. I don't think there was a class on like how to manage a sales team. And then when I got into the real world, it was like, whoa, like how did I miss this entire skill set that it is absolutely core and critical to business. Everything, in my opinion, is sales. Not every single thing, but like 70, 80% of business is sales. Hiring is a sales process. Sales is a sales process. Fundraising is sales, right? It's all sales of different flavors. And so to skip that curriculum in business school it was just odd to me in retrospect.
Yeah, I think you're making an excellent point. When I think about the capacity of serving as a CEO in various different companies, you're either selling your board, you're either out selling potential investors trying to raise money, you're either selling young recruits as to why they need to join you upon some journey, you're either selling your existing customers to maintain them as customers or selling prospects to win them as customers. And you're also, in terms of working with your suppliers and a lot of your collaborators and a lot of the folks with whom you're trying to establish partnerships. If you do not develop a skill set around the give to get and to understand that process of getting to yes, whether it's, like I said, whether it's getting to yes in terms of fundraise, getting to yes in terms of getting the board to approve your next year's plan, getting to yes with that young recruit to say to join your company and to join you on the journey. It's absolutely a fundamental skill set in business if you're going to achieve any type of success.
I want to thank Jim for joining us on the show today, but I want to let listeners know if you're enjoying the conversation, you're in luck. Jim has agreed to join us for a second podcast edition where we're going to dive deeper into sales processes, building out sales teams. I'm going to get an education. Hopefully everybody that's listening is going to get an education. And so today we're going to focus primarily on Jim's career, but I did want to give you that little nugget to look forward to for a future episode. So we're not going to focus on how sales works and how to get better at sales, but I do want to ask you one quick question before we talk a little bit more about your career, which is that how did you learn the skill set? I look at you, you're someone I look up to, someone that I admire. You've been a mentor, you've been helping us with our sales process. How did you get good at the skill set? How did you learn it in the first place?
I think like anything else, you just have to decide. One of the things I absolutely love about being a part of the world today is how there's so much information and tutorials and guides at our fingertips. Everything is accessible via places like YouTube or TED Talks or master classes, etc. And so you simply have to become a student of the game, and you have to, and it's just like I assume a doctor, every day you have to stay abreast as to new techniques, new channels, opportunities. I'm all over generative AI and what's now possible in terms of the speed with which we are able to create the content that sells, to be able to just shorten the sales cycles of getting to yes with our clients. And it's one, understanding basic human psychology and becoming a student of those elements of it. But now the tools and the systems and the resources at our fingertips to really allow us to gain great efficiency and to be able to be much more productive and effective with a lot of these sales techniques.
So it's brick by brick, right? Just
Without
like,
question.
yeah, anything that's complicated, it takes time. You have to have some patience and just invest a bit. Every call, thinking about what did I do well? What could I have done better? And it's iterative over time, just like pretty much everything in business and life. I want to ask you a little bit and transition the conversation into a bit about your career. So after business school, you went to JP Morgan Chase. It's actually not on your LinkedIn, but tell me about your time at JP Morgan Chase. What were you doing? What kind of skill sets were you learning? And then I have one or two follow-on questions about the value of going to a big firm.
Yeah, it was a bit fortuitous in that I worked at JP Morgan Chase on the credit card services side. I was working out of Wilmington, Delaware, and they had a co-branded credit card program. They do to this day, of course. And they had just signed the Naval Academy. And they were looking for their token Naval Academy person to be the account manager. And they actually sold that as part of the offer for the Naval Academy to actually contract with JP Morgan for this co-branded card account. And it was really there that I became the military program account manager. So it was the VFW, it was Ladies Auxiliary VFW, all the different military associations that were looking to do co-branded credit cards. And it was really there that I started to understand, one, how to do account management, but very importantly, when you're in the credit card business, right? It's consumer credit lending, if you will. I started to learn a lot about marketing and sales. Now, this was B2C. And in a big established organization like JP Morgan, you had a lot of experts to learn from. And so once again, being not too far out of the military, just out of business school, the opportunity to apply some of these learnings, or one, to learn sales and marketing, and then ultimately to apply them, was a big opportunity. And my final role there, I had gotten promoted fairly quickly, and my final role there was leading the Disney credit card program. And that was really interesting because I learned a lot about brand management. Obviously, Disney is one of the world-class brands. And in working with their brand team about what was on brand, what was off brand, I just learned a lot about how important it is in terms of all the interactions that a brand has and how it's manifested through its team members, how it's manifested through public collateral, how important it is to manage what David Akers, the brand czar, says, those strong, favorable, unique associations to an entity. And even while at JP Morgan, they had the Starbucks, and Starbucks is another great brand, but they were very deliberate about the pillars of their brand. And I just became a student of that. So for example, in Starbucks, they were very much focused on premium quality as one of the pillars. They were very much focused on the barista, a knowledgeable barista that they supported in their career endeavors. And the third one was around the community. They started the Starbucks Foundation, right? So all the interactions, all the different touch points as it related to the Starbucks brand was really a function of the barista, the premium coffee, and the Starbucks community and their contributions to it. And I just thought that was pretty powerful because companies, even like Mark Benioff, I referred to him earlier and what he's done at Salesforce, the way he manages those strong, favorable, unique associations with all his constituents, his team members, his investors, his customers. It's that consistency around those pillars, those associations that we want in the context of a brand.
That must have been a masterclass. I think Disney's it is one of the most iconic brands, like Disney, Nike, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, to your point. These are iconic brands, and Disney's entire business is predicated or built on the back of a consistent brand experience. Did this fascinating case study in business schools, like all of the different revenue streams are all just built around the brand to give one consistent experience, whether it's the hotels, it's the movies, it's the parks, it's the cruise line, like it's the shop and merchandise. It's all so consistent. It's giving you exactly the same experience and inspiring the same feeling through the brand. It's like,
Brendan, I think you summarized it exceptionally well. When I think about one of my greatest accomplishments, it's going to sound a bit silly. One of my greatest accomplishments working with Disney, when the program was just launched with JP Morgan Chase, they would not allow any of the Disney characters to appear on the card. Now, to your good point, think about this. You don't want to diminish the Disney brand because not everybody's going to be approved for a credit card. So Disney did not want to have the negative association with denying somebody, right? They're all inclusive. They didn't want to be discriminatory now that's obviously a fact of life in the credit card industry. So building trust, building confidence that we could protect the Disney brand and be consistent in the context of being compliant with their brand guidelines ultimately landed us the opportunity to put Tinkerbell or Mickey Mouse on the front of the card. And you can imagine from a new customer acquisition perspective, new card customer acquisition, it skyrocketed. It was one of the biggest coups that we had. People just had this emotional, sentimental value, and they wanted to proudly put down their Tinkerbell card or their Mickey card. So anyway, this idea of trust and safeguarding the brand was first and foremost for the Disney brand.
That's like fascinating. But like, it's impossible not to reflect on your own experiences and interactions with the brand when you think about Disney. But it's just so powerful and so positive, and they get them while they're young. They're like upstream of every business in the world.
We actually had a marketing sub-segment that we called the Disney Files because they were just so over the top in terms of the strength of their affinity to the Disney brand.
They had that hotel for the Star Wars themed hotel that they launched a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that. That was like a windowless hotel with just screens and like fully immersive. And it was so expensive that I was like, man, these are like the zealots. These are like, I'm sure Disney would, they're like true zealots. So I want to ask you, speaking of brands, I want to ask you about, sometimes when I get transitioning vets I'm talking to, I feel like there are benefits to associating your name and your business career with brands that can be additive or beneficial. It's natural psychological phenomenon that when we see two things that are right next to each other, we associate them together for better or worse. Obviously, essentially, this is not obvious, but that is essentially one of the main value props of going to an elite university, whether it's undergrad, whether it's an MBA program. And I think the same thing is true early in the career for going to a name brand firm like JP Morgan. Curious to hear whether you would recommend that folks go to a bigger firm with a name brand to begin building those associations in their business careers early. Is that something that's been beneficial to you? Would you just be curious to hear any thoughts that you've had on whether that's beneficial?
It's an interesting question because I don't know that I went to JP Morgan thinking like that. I think it was somewhat opportunistic in my particular case. Now, just because I wasn't thinking it doesn't mean your statement's not true. I think without question, if the end game was for me to work with publicly traded companies, particularly in the financial services realm, big, strong brand recognition like a JP Morgan or a Citibank, that has the cachet and the ability to be able to get in a company like that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, most of my career has since been in and around tech. And so working for Meta, formerly Facebook, or having worked for X, formerly Twitter, these are name brands that in the tech space, even if you're just a former employee, most people will put it in their headline and tagline. So without question, it has cachet and it has value. I will say, though, hearkening back to an answer I gave earlier, it's a personal choice. And the reason it's personal is you have to think a little bit about the end game. What is it that you want to be when you're all grown up? And what becomes the North Star in your career? I can tell you that the fact that I worked at JP Morgan Chase, you mentioned, it's not even on my LinkedIn. It's not entrepreneurial, so to speak, and it's not part of the world that I've been a part of for the last 20, 30 years, or maybe 20 years. And what I hated about working at JP Morgan Chase is the bureaucracy. Back then, it was in 34 different countries, 168,000 employees, 6 major divisions. And I didn't feel as though I could have the voice and have the impact that I was seeking. And in too many ways, the bureaucracy that became a big publicly traded company was too reminiscent of the bureaucracy that had become the military. And so I purposely left the military because I wanted to find my voice and write a new chapter in my life. And after about 6 years at JP Morgan Chase, with my MBA in hand and an opportunity to leave financial services and move into data analytics, I went and joined the team at Dun & Bradstreet.
Yeah, I will speak out of both sides of my mouth and say I also come across folks for whom chasing these brand names has had an adverse effect on their career. Like it's caused them to be like, I have to go to X, Y, and Z thing because that's like a brand name that everybody knows. It's going to be good for my career. And I'm just going to delay this doing the things that I want to do or learning the skill sets that I want to learn because I'm chasing these shiny objects and I need this like approval from peers or whoever that comes from working at a gold-plated brand like JP Morgan.
Quickly on that, in an effort to help some of your listeners, I think those who feel that pressure, perhaps part of the reason they feel the pressure is for the same reasons I did. I was insecure and I was not confident that I was going to be able to make it. And so I was trusting others to define for me what my career path had to be. Now, my older self, if I had to give advice to my younger self, I would have said, patience, grasshopper, you're going to be just fine. Follow your own star, figure out what it is you want to do, what you are passionate about, and just trust yourself. I find that sometimes we allow ourselves to be corralled or pushed into these types of, you must do this or you must do that, because it's part of the military thinking, right? In order to qualify for command, you're told you got to do this type of job and you got a PCS to here. And there's a roadmap in order to make captain or to make admiral or to get command. It's not that way in the civilian world. It really isn't. And so you've got a lot more freedom and a lot more latitude. And sometimes that's unnerving, right? Because it's not so highly structured like it was when we were in the military. And without that structure, we're not sure what to do. But if you trust yourself and chart your own path and follow your heart, things take care of themselves.
Yeah, you've hit on a really important point that I try and drive home. It's been a few episodes since I think I brought it up, but some listeners, longtime listeners of the podcast might be like, dude, stop bringing this up. But the military has this linear career path, whereas civilian business careers are non-linear. Right. We don't wear the rank on the sleeves. You don't wear your ribbons on your chest. There's not these like wickets that I have to hit. Sometimes there are opportunities in your career that will be stepwise, where it's 10 steps forward. And then there'll be opportunities in your career where you're just fighting to stay alive. It's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. Right. 1 step forward, 3 steps back. And you're just like trying to fight out of a hole. And those things will be true probably for everybody's civilian business career. And so that patience, having that tactical patience with your career and being able to set a vision for what you want to accomplish and where you want to go is important and incredibly difficult to do. Just because, again, there's just so little knowledge that we have when we can transition out on what these civilian careers look like.
Completely agree.
Jim, I want to transition or ask you a follow-on question. It's specific to marketing and sales, but I'm curious how it differs from a big, more bureaucratic organization versus an entrepreneurial organization. How do those two different entities, or being an employee or maybe a founder at one of those two entities, how do they differ in their approach to sales and marketing at a big organization versus an entrepreneurial earlier stage company?
I think my frame of reference is that when I worked at JP Morgan Chase, as I mentioned before, we were a B2C business and we had 6 major divisions. I was in the consumer side. So they link checking and savings and debt products like credit cards under separate divisions, right? Very different than investment banking, very different than, let's say, treasury, et cetera. And so they have the broad JP Morgan Chase brand. That is the umbrella brand that's got lots of years of trust that have been well established. And so very well-defined brand guidelines. All the marketing must be compliant and consistent with that. And what you find, and I think I'm finally getting to the answer of your question, is the degrees of latitude, the degrees of freedom to be empowered, to scribble outside the lines they're largely non-existent in working with those big brands, and they're very slow moving. So the Visas, the JP Morgans, the Citis, those brands are, I'll say, less dynamic and a little bit more stoic. Whereas, to your question, on the entrepreneurial side, you're looking at what is and thinking about what could be, and then focused on making it. And you have to cut through the clutter because you're not a well-established brand. So I go back to those points around strong, favorable, unique. And in order to do that, you've got a series of decisions that you have to make. And you have to be very mindful of the ideal customer profile and the buyer persona and the target market that you're trying to appeal to. So as we both learned in business school, a marketing positioning statement is always a frame of reference for fitness enthusiasts. We are, right? And then it's points of parity. How are you similar to the major players in your space? And then the points of difference. In a particular frame of reference, what is it that you do that meet the minimum credentials? And then what do you do special? What's your special sauce or your superpower? So in a nutshell, though, you're in an entrepreneurial venture, you're charting that path. You're making those decisions. You're trying to establish those associations, those unique associations. And I find that much more exciting because you've got to cut through the clutter. You've got to find a way to break through, and you've got to find a way to be new and interesting, and then ultimately to create sustainable value for your clients. And that could be a function of, once again, it could be your target audience. It could be the uniqueness of your value prop and how you message the benefits associated there too. But then also a function of the marketing channels and the types of campaigns that you run.
Yeah, I just want to riff off a few things that you said. First of all, I feel like I didn't have any understanding whatsoever of brand building or what a brand was when I transitioned out of the military, which is ironic because the Marine Corps has got a great brand.
Yes,
it's got one of the world's best brands. And a brand, for when I was coming out of business school, some of the startup ideas that I had were like, we can build a brand around doing X, Y, or Z. And I don't think I fully understood that building a brand can cost billions of dollars and take decades. Yes, like it is not typically a differentiator for an early stage company. A mature company like JP Morgan Chase has had so much mind share with people for so long that a few things are true. One, they don't have to work as hard to get that mind share. They might have to spend a lot of money because they're trying to grow and they're already reaching millions or hundreds of millions of people. But the amount of mind share that the bank occupies with the average consumer is so much more significant than an entrepreneurial brand. That has a couple of challenges associated with it. Like one, it's almost impossible to pivot. Like you can see companies talk about reinventing their brand or trying to move up market. And these are like, you are not measuring these things in quarters. You're not measuring them in years. These are like decades long evolutions. Read an article the other day about Peloton, which is a fairly early stage company that spent a lot of money building its brand, trying to expand beyond just bikes. And they're having a really tough time becoming a fitness company because everybody knows them as the bike company. Whereas with an entrepreneurial company, it is almost exactly the reverse. It's like you can pivot your brand on a dime. You have no ability to spend money on marketing. So you're mostly just grabbing a megaphone and screaming as much as possible on social media that you exist and what you do over and over again. And it's about trying to capture as much mind share as possible, but the ability to pivot the brand is significantly different. And you see it even on sales calls. You can make micro adjustments and it's an iterative process over time that is just far more flexible. So anyway, wanted to add my own kind of 2 cents there.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There's obviously great case studies, companies like Dunkin' Donuts, right? They wanted to rebrand from being thought of as donuts to being maybe better understood and appreciated for coffee, everything from their and that was a slow moving brand. There's also one other quick anecdote since we've got a military crowd. Nissan, which was a big aircraft manufacturer during World War II, for a lot of military veterans who came out of that greatest generation who fought in World War II, they associated Nissan with the Japanese and the war. And so as they pivoted from aircraft engines into automobiles in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they marketed the Nissan brand around the world, but in the United States, it was Datsun because they knew they would not be able to sell a Nissan car in the United States because of the carryover negative sentiment of World War II veterans. And as they evolved the brand, it went from Datsun to Nissan Datsun to by the late 80s and early 1990s, they were finally able to strip the Datsun name off. There was enough time that had passed. And now Nissan is just known as a Japanese car manufacturer here in the United States.
That is an interesting case study. And to your point, it took years and years, right? Those pivots are challenging when it's a larger incumbent brand. I want to ask a bit about, you went over to Dun & Bradstreet. You had a fairly swift and meteoric rise there before leaving. And you mentioned that next transition was facilitated by or influenced by Mark Benioff. I want to ask you about how you two met. He's a pretty legendary figure in tech. And then I want you to talk a little bit, if you tell us a little bit about the value of just networking in general. It's a point that I feel like transitioning veterans have heard a million times, but they don't necessarily always know what it means and how it can be beneficial. And so I think this might be just an interesting place to discuss the concept of networking and how it can benefit one's career.
Yeah, there's two parts to your question. The first part is the work that Dun & Bradstreet and Salesforce did together. And I was very fortunate to be in the middle of all that. The story actually begins in 2007, 2008, when we had this great financial crisis in America, and the $500 million piece of business that I was responsible for was in a meteoric decline. We worked with the Fortune 1000 and we sold big data files, business data files, that helped support a lot of their sales and marketing efforts. But at this particular time in this recessionary environment, a lot of the folks to whom we sold, they said, listen, we simply can't afford it anymore. So we had to reinvent ourselves, which is what you do during hard times. And part of that reinventing ourselves was trying to find ways to create what we were calling data as a service. Mark had pioneered software as a service, but as we looked at his business, his CRM software, the data in the customer data records was often wrong. They might have Brendan Aronson, but they might have you at your former place of employment. They might have the wrong contact information, et cetera. And so the opportunity was to partner with Salesforce, whereby we could provide fresh data feeds into his customer data records. At the time, there was a born on date with Budweiser beer. And we literally, within the CRM, were creating a profile such that each new time you logged in, you could see which data fields were being refreshed or had been updated since the last time you had used it. And my premise to Mark was simple. I said, look, and at the time, folks were paying about $55 per seat per month. I said, but all the money you're investing in the feature functionality of the software, it's all for naught if the data running through it is crap. And if we could create data as a service to match your software as a service, I think you'll be able to double the size of your business. And it was really there in the process of him liking that idea and us beginning to work that idea over the course of the next 2-3 year period that really gave launch. And it was really there that Mark saw in me much more of an entrepreneurial spirit, and he had bought a company that was in the social media monitoring space. And he said, look, Delaney, if you had done as an entrepreneur what you've done at Dun & Bradstreet, you would have made hundreds of millions of dollars. And then I started to realize, man, I am much more of an entrepreneur. And then from there, I started working for PE firms and VC and just running businesses. And that was really the chance interaction, and just a brilliant business mind. I'm just blown away by Mark's ability that, of course, everybody well understands at this point. To your comment about networking, man, you come out of the Navy and you get comfortable with the people that may be at the similar title and position, or maybe even specialty field, but it's just absolutely a business success requirement that you get comfortable being uncomfortable, networking with other people, and not when you need something. And this is, I think, the most important point about networking is that you have to be there in good times and in bad, and you have to be there to help before you can ask to be helped. And so that takes time too. So if you always look to give before you look to ask, I think that, and it has to be natural and it has to be authentic and it can't feel contrived. But if you do those things, if you're always there looking to network, always looking to give and to partner, it just comes back to you. It is really, truly karma.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. There are a couple of books for listeners that I'd recommend. One is Give and Take by Adam Grant. Jim, I'm not sure if you come across this book, but it's basically ripped off directly from your philosophy on networking. It's give, and then don't be afraid to ask for help when the time is right. And then the second is Never Eat Alone, which is by Keith Ferrazzi. If you're looking for like a masterclass or like a PhD on networking and how to do it in a way that is not transactional, that is your book. I recommend it strongly. So if you're a listener, definitely check out those books. Jim, I want to ask about the pivot then into private equity leadership and venture-backed startups. How did you move into the ecosystem? And then what was it like to be a private equity-backed C-suite executive?
It's a very different game right out the gate, right? Because I felt that when you work for a big corporation like JP Morgan Chase, you could, and this is not meant to be disparaging, but you can blend in with part of your team. As long as your team is generally successful, you can continue to be successful. But when you work in the world of VC and PE, there's a Klieg light on you. You feel like a professional athlete where your stats are being evaluated almost after every game, after every performance, after every quarter. You never quite get comfortable sitting in the boardroom as the CEO because you think that, heck, if we're not delivering and we're not producing, they could be making a decision post this board meeting that it's time for Jim to go. And so but there's also a thrill to that, right? Because you get to eat what you kill. And if you kill big animals, you get to eat really well. So there's a lot of fun. There can be some fair wealth that can be accumulated in the context of this, but you really are betting on yourself oftentimes. And it was really that shift between no place to run and hide. I want to step forward and be counted. And I basically, because a lot of times you find yourself making claims about how big and fast you're going to grow the following year. And quite candidly, you have some ideas about how the hell you're going to do it, but there's certainly not a high degree of confidence that it can be done because you're going where no man has gone before sometimes. And so it's a very different type of personality, very different type of game. And in the time I had spent in aviation, those sort of Billy Badass type who just said probably had a little bit too much bravado and just it better suited my personality for sure.
There's this like undercurrent to how you describe it that I want to make explicit for listeners who might not have as much business experience. And the undercurrent as you're evaluating career opportunities is that there is a trade-off between risk and return. In any type of investment, typically, if you are looking for outsized returns, you will have to incur more risk to do. You can invest in the 10-year treasury rate, and that is extremely low risk. The things that would have to be true for that to not return for you would be cataclysmic and catastrophic for the US economy. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, an early stage company is incredibly risky, but then the outcomes that you can create personally are obviously dramatic. If you look at the billionaires list, it's folks in finance who have started financial services firms or investing firms, and then it's entrepreneurs who have taken tremendous risk and it's panned out for them. So I just want to highlight that trade-off as potentially a useful framework for thinking about one's business career, this trade-off between risk and then potential return. I've heard private equity ops described as the best like risk-adjusted way to build wealth because it's a little bit less risky than trying to build a venture-backed startup, but still has some of those outsized impacts. Curious to hear if you have any thoughts on the topic before we dive into what you're doing today at Traction AI.
Yeah, listen, I think you summarized it exceptionally well. It is a risk-reward profile for sure. I think obviously on the VC side, it is higher risk, but you're looking to attack and grow into a new market opportunity with a new good product or service. Without question, on the PE side, they like to see top-line growth, of course, but they are the masters at expense management, finding expense synergies when acquiring a new asset, and then finding ways to maximize bottom line, right? So it's about efficiency, it's about effectiveness, it's about productivity, and it's about maximizing net profit. And everything you said is exactly right in terms of risk reward. What was your next question?
I want to lead into and wet people's whistle a little bit on the topic of Traction AI, which is the company that you've built. We've taken advantage of your service, and it's been an amazing experience for us. Tell me a little bit about how'd you launch the company? What do you guys do? And how do you spend your time today?
Yeah, thank you for the question, of course. Along the journey of the last, 4 or 5 different ventures I've been a part of, and as I mentioned, with a couple of exits, It was really a function of bringing together a team. It's always the success that we ultimately have is our ability to attract great talent and then create parameters for them and then get out of their way and just give them the tools and the resources to be successful. One guy that I ended up hiring was a West Pointer that I'd gone to Wharton Business School with. And he came in and he was a tank commander during Iraq. And everything was a playbook to him. Everything was a standard operating procedure. And all the go-to-market activities that we had on the sales, the marketing, and the customer success side, they had to be codified. They had to be trained to. So it was all about standardization, streamlining our processes, making things consistent that ultimately allowed us to scale and to automate. And so he was your Six Sigma lean management guy 15, 20 years ago, creating what today we call revenue operations. And he was so successful with our doing it, I realized it was a special superpower, this superpower of revenue operations that were streamlined and efficient, where marketing, sales, and customer success were integrated, and then the application of best demonstrated practice around key processes: lead scoring, lead nurturing, lead management, pipeline management, sales forecasting, renewal management, et cetera. And John and I, just every time I would get a new gig, we'd either have an exit, we'd put the band back together, I'd hire a bunch of the same people, and we did this multiple times.
That's awesome.
And we started to realize that we developed this superpower around go-to-market. And our sweet spot, where we took a company, this company Sysomos, they were at 15 million annual recurring revenue. And within 30 months, we were at $50 million. And
wow.
It was really a function of being able to bring these playbooks to sales, marketing, customer success. Now, obviously, you have to have a favorable market. Obviously, you have to have a good product or service or tech. But do not underestimate the efficiency and the power of strong coordination between sales, marketing, customer success. And that's a function of your systems. That's a function of your processes. That's a function of your teams and how well they interact, and a function of their behaviors, right? The habits that you teach them in terms of go-to-market. And so that's the playbook that we've been applying across multiple businesses. And so Traction was born because during COVID, we're like, heck, we keep doing this, and it's always about what's the next gig, what's the next show, what's the next heist. But why don't we help entrepreneurs do that? Why don't we become that secret superpower for entrepreneurs? And we have focused in on the military entrepreneur to help them with their go-to-market. So oftentimes after they've raised some capital and they're thinking about, let's say, using a HubSpot or a Salesforce, and they're trying to professionalize some of the sales and marketing processes, they bring us in and we partner. We become outsourced partners with them. We help them grow and scale their companies. We help you get funded and then stay funded, and we help you go from startup to grow up. And so that's really the background on Traction AI.
The function that you've described, first of all, it's like a master's level description of revenue operations. Like I consider myself someone that likes sales, that likes to learn sales, that likes to practice it. And you're just like batting out of my league. So it is educational to just even hear you describe the many factors that go into building a successful revenue operations team and philosophy. And then I would also say, I've talked about this a little bit already, Bill, that is just the most critical business function. When we talk to private equity investors about the businesses that they're buying, and there are almost no situations that you cannot solve by just growing your way out of them.
100%.
As long as your sales are growing, you can spend the money to improve the operations. You can spend the money to figure out how to take costs out of the business. All of that stuff is like very doable as long as the top line is growing. And that skill set is just pays huge dividends over the course of their career. It pays huge dividends for companies that invest into it. I also just want to give like a personal plug here. Our company has grown quickly. We've been very lucky to operate in a space that I think is attractive. We certainly work hard, but you guys have amplified the effectiveness of our sales processes and procedures dramatically. Every time I hop on the phone with you and David, I learn something new every single time without fail. And then you guys are doers. You roll up your sleeves as a partner and as a service provider in a way that is, I just aspire to do it for our own company because we're a services business too. Care about your customers, their problems are your problems, you're responsive as hell, and really just like embrace your clients' challenges as if they're your own in a way that I feel like is just the secret sauce for building services companies. As long as you're ruthlessly customer focused, I think things generally go well for services businesses. And you guys really exemplify that to me.
Thank you. Very much appreciate your kind words. When we endeavored to build this company as former operators, we really wanted to be doers. We wanted to be outsourced members of the team and to be thought as such. And it's fun because there's an opportunity in many ways for me to give back. I've learned a lot of lessons over a lot of mistakes over the last 25 years. And so if there's an opportunity to save some other people a few of these battle scars, it's always great to do that.
On our next podcast that Jim and I record together, we're going to dive deeper into revenue operations. We're doing it, obviously, so that our listeners can benefit from Jim's robust experience building these functions. We're also doing it so that Brendan can benefit from it. I've got a lot of questions on sales I need some help with still. And you can just never be good enough at it. And it truly is the backbone of all business. To close out the episode today, Jim, first I want to thank you for joining us. I think this is one of the most informative episodes we've ever recorded. And so I'm grateful for you coming on here and sharing your knowledge. The final question I want to ask you is for general advice that you might have for transitioning veterans. What do you wish that you had known? You've covered a few topics that you wish you had known, but if you were to give advice to someone that's transitioning out of the military today and try and boil it down to maybe 1 or 2 points, what would you say?
I think we've covered them. I think the point that you made, which I think is excellent, is around getting comfortable, learning how to network. And it's the give and take and some of the books you've even recommended. So I think without question, the ability to network is really important. The second thing I'd say is a point that I had made about trust yourself. Literally take some time, take inventory of what it is that you like to do, what some of your skill sets are, and decide what you want your North Star to be in the context of your career, and then trust yourself. I just find that, like myself and so many vets that I've seen, they take that first job that's available to them or what gets offered to them, and they don't take the time to do this introspection, and they don't take the time to trust themselves. And if I could, as I mentioned earlier, speak to my former younger self, that would be the advice.
Jim, where can people find out more about your work, get in touch, and learn more about Traction AI?
Yeah, thank you. We're at www.gettraction.ai. And if folks would like to reach out to me directly, it's very simple, jim@gettraction.ai. And that's 2 T's, GET traction.ai.
Awesome. Please go blow up Jim's inbox if you're listening to the show. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the follow-on conversation. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. For listeners of the show, we have a bunch of in-person events coming up. We've got a few. We're recording this on the 10th of November. God bless. We are recording this on the 10th of September. We have a bunch of in-person events coming up between now and the end of the year. We've got them in Philadelphia, in DC. We've got them in Texas. We got one coming up in Austin. We got one coming up in Dallas. We're going to have one in Park City in time for ski season. That's mostly so I can get some turns in, but I'm looking forward to seeing you all there anyway. Join us at one of the in-person events. Check them out at themilvet.org/events. We've got a ton of new opportunities for veterans. We've got executive roles. We've got some more entry-level roles as well, both in private equity ops and aerospace and defense. You can find out more about those at themilvet.org/careers. Go check them out. Sign up for the newsletter to stay up to date on podcasts and live events, plus our open roles that we post every single week. Hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll catch you guys back here next week.